Welcome to Exploding Brooklyn, newspaper accounts of Brooklyn's industrial history on Newtown Creek, a podcast from Tripping Balls Through History. Survivor, often prisoner, sometimes sex worker, the ferociously independent woman named Mary Ann Duffy shows up in the papers at least 40 times through the years, always involved in crime as victim and perpetrator. In this first instance, she is horribly attacked with sulfuric acid. Sunday, June 21, 1846, the New York Daily Herald. Outrageous trick. A fellow called John Williams, alias Little Johnny, was arrested yesterday on a charge of throwing a quantity of oil of vitriol upon a girl called Mary Ann Duffy in a house of prostitution, number 52 Anthony Street, injuring her on the face and head very severely. The magistrate held him to bail in $500 to answer at court, in default of which he was locked up. Monday, November 19, 1855, the Buffalo Courier, another house of ill fame broken up. Captain Peter Weeder of Police District No. 4 made a descent with a posse of police upon a house of ill fame on Elm Street, kept by Mary Ann Duffy on Thursday night, and arrested all the inmates of the house, 5 women and 4 men. They were all committed the next day by the Watch House Justice for 30 days each. Friday, November 23, 1860, the Times-Union, Fox versus Duffy. A few days ago, Justice Colhan issued a warrant for the arrest of a woman named Ann Duffy, who was charged by Mrs. Eliza Fox with grand larceny in stealing from her wearing apparel of the value of $34. The warrant was placed in the hands of Officer Bell, but he was unable to find Ann Duffy, she having left the United States and gone to Jersey. Yesterday, Mrs. Fox went to the house of Mrs. Catherine Duffy in Remsen Street to make some inquiries about the absconding Ann. While there, Catherine treated her with the most marked hospitality and prepared a nice glass of warm gin and water for her refreshment, and promised to ascertain the whereabouts of Ann Duffy. Mrs. Fox left the domicile of the Duffys in a happy frame of mind and returned to her own home in Union Avenue, upon reaching which she discovered that she had been robbed of $10, and she believed that Catherine Duffy had taken it. She at once made her loss known to the police, and Mrs. C. Duffy was arrested and locked up to answer the charge. 6 weeks later, the Times-Union reports that Ann Duffy appeared before Justice Colhan on a charge of petty larceny on the complaint of Mrs. Sarah Fox, from whom, it was alleged, Ann had feloniously abstracted a shawl. When the case was called up, the prosecuting witness failed to answer, and Ann escaped the condign punishment that certainly awaited her, and took her departure in evident glee. Some 2 hours later, poor Miss Duffy was again in the clutches of the law, on a warrant issued by Justice Walter, but this time her offense was magnified into grand larceny, on which serious charge she will be tried today. The Brooklyn Evening Star's story adds a little detail on the same day. On Friday night, Mrs. Fox of North 5th Street discovered that a valuable shawl had been feloniously carried from the premises, and she believed that her female help, Ann Duffy, had taken it. But because Mrs. Fox refused to appear to press the charge, Miss Duffy was restored to liberty. The next month, a Mary McCormack was arrested for relieving Ann Duffy of her shawl, the same shawl that Ann had stolen from Mrs. Fox. The Times-Union tells the story. Mary says she didn't steal the shawl, and comes to court about it. They both live in North 4th Street side by side and have hitherto been considered good friends and have visited each other. According to Anne's story yesterday, Mary took up her baby and run in to visit Anne. When she got ready to go home, it was almost night, and rather cool to take baby out as he had nothing on but a nightgown. Anne offered to lend her a shawl to wrap around the spalpeen, which offer Mary accepted, but Anne wanted her shawl back again, which want Mary did not seem ready to comply with. Mary hid it in the bed tick, away down at the foot of the bed, and denied having it when Anne asked for it. So Anne ran off to the police and had a warrant issued for poor Mary's arrest. This frightened Mary very much, and this morning Anne found the shawl at her door all full of straw, so it was. And she hadn't shook it out, but there it was with her, and she showed it exultingly. The prisoner, complainant, husbands, cousins, babies, and shawls were all sent home with an admonition against like behavior in the future. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle reports that the shawl was worth $3 and that Mary was liberated after promising to make restitution and pay expenses. September 1861 has the Brooklyn Daily Eagle reporting on Anne as Old Hat. Unfortunates, Mamsells Annie Doherty and Mary Ann Duffy, alias Clinker, were before the court this morning for about the 100th time. Annie was sent for 20 days to the penitentiary as a vagrant, and her frail companion is held for further examination on the charge of foreshortening by a joint the finger of one Mr. McCracken. A month later, Ann Duffy is arrested for a drunk and disorderly. 2 months later, the Times-Union is reporting on the social evil. Once in a while, a few stray specimens of the unfortunate class make their appearance in our streets, but they are always promptly arrested by the police. Last night, 2 well-known characters of this class, named Eliza Higgins and Mary Ann Duffy, were arrested in Fulton Street. They were brought before Justice Perry this morning, who sent them to the penitentiary as vagrants for 4 months. The same day, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle celebrates this with the headline, "Once More Upon the Waters," and calls the 2 women well-known nymphs du pavé, meaning streetwalkers, and commenting, "Somehow or ever, there is always a bring forth the body at the service of these gals, for no sooner they're in than they're out again." If she served the 4 months, then 1 month after getting out, in May 1862, Ann Duffy is busted again. The Times-Union reporting on a descent on disorderly houses from complaints made at the 46th Station House, a descent on 2 well-known houses of ill fame, was determined on for Tuesday night. Sergeant Sherman, with officers Volz, Bunce, Dunham, Petrie, and Adami, first visited the house of Mrs. Ellen Sullivan of number 260 South 2nd Street. Here they found a man who gave his name as George W. Thomas and 4 girls named Ann Duffy, Ann McLaughlin, Maria Riley, Eliza Curtis, and an old woman 71 years old named Betsy Campbell. It is hardly necessary to say that this last-named woman was complained against simply as a vagrant. The police afterward also visited the house of Elizabeth Albrecht, number 43 Montrose Avenue, where they arrested the proprietress and a girl named Mary Peters. These prizes were all towed into the harbor of the station house by the officers, and were brought up yesterday before Justice Walter. Thomas, who is one of the short-haired boys, was first disposed of, and said that he was a beau of Ann Duffy, and thought there was no harm in going to see her. The judge dismissed him on his paying the costs of the court. The women were all sent to the penitentiary for 90 days, or until they should be able to find sureties in the sum of $500. For 17 months, Anne disappears from the papers, until the Times-Union reports on March 23, 1864, about fashionable intelligence. Ann Duffy was last night discovered in one of the attics of number 11 South 5th Street, suffering from intoxication and exposure. It is said there are no less than 20 families in this house. She was brought to the station house on 4th Avenue and properly cared for. This morning, Justice Colohan sent her up for 10 days. It is hoped that with the healthful exercise and good air of Flatbush, Anne will soon be able to be out again. With typical disdain of prisoners, called items, who are always being held in places called pens and cages, an animalistic language that portrays how the slave system developed into the prison system, the Times-Union reports on August 23, 1864, on Justice Daly's cage. The cage in Justice Daly's court was full this morning, but the inmates were items of no account, being, for the most part, old bummers who have never been sober in their lives. Ann Duffy and Bridget Burke were up, the one for vagrancy and the other for drunkenness. Ann was sent to the penitentiary for 6 months, and Bridget for 10 days. Bridget Head was also sent to the penitentiary for 6 months. 13 months later, in September 1865, the New York Daily Herald reports that Ann Duffy, who stole $59 worth of ladies' clothing from Elizabeth Althor, was sent to the penitentiary for 1 year. It does not look like she served the whole year, since 4 months later the Brooklyn Daily Eagle has excuse to use their favorite dismissive phrase, nymphs du pauvre, again about disgraceful conduct. Justice Cornwell this morning sent 2 nymphs du pauvre to jail for 20 days each for insulting a gentleman in company with his wife on Fulton Avenue last evening. Yesterday they concluded a term of 3 months each at the penitentiary. Their names are Anna Doherty and Mary Ann Duffy, both noted characters. This would be the same Anna Doherty who was arrested with Anne in 1861 as her frail companion, who was held for further examination on the charge of foreshortening by a joint the finger of one Mr. McCracken. These two show up together again in March 1866, as reported in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Justice Morehouse yesterday morning tried 18 bummers, otherwise persons charged with being drunk, and the sentence varied according to the cases. There were 3 females charged with vagrancy, named Ann Doherty, Mary Ann Duffy, and Rosa Garahan, who are noted characters, and have several times heretofore appeared in a police court. They walk the streets at times, act in a queer manner, and live without any visible means of support. They received sentences sending them to the penitentiary for 30 days. The cases tried yesterday were the accumulation of the arrests made in 2 days by the police of the 44th Precinct, who gobble such persons as vagrants and drunkards in short order, as crimes of greater weight are scarce in their precinct. More than 2 years later, Anne brings a case that is dismissed, as reported in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle on November 21, 1868, alleged theft of a diamond ring. A Mrs. Sarah E. Spragg was taken before Justice Eames today, charged with the theft of a diamond ring at the complaint of Mrs. Ann Duffy of number 236 Graham Avenue, Eastern District. The accused, who resides in New York, had visited the house of complainant about 3 weeks since, and 2 weeks after her departure the ornament was missed. The evidence not being in the least of a positive character, the justice discharged Mrs. Spragg, much to her delight. Almost a year later, the Eagle is reporting on the grab game. Ann Duffy, an old offender, on Saturday afternoon snatched at and tore away a fob chain from the vest of a youth named E.J. Goodman, whom she encountered in Grand Street, Eastern District, and made tracks to escape with the booty, which she doubtless supposed valuable, not knowing the difference between oroid and gold, but was overhauled by Officer Abbott. The chain was found in her possession when taken to the station house, and upon being arraigned before Justice Voorhees today, Anne was sent to the penitentiary for 60 days. For St. Patrick's Day in 1871, and celebrated with perhaps defiance of a sexual assault as reported in the Brooklyn Union. Another relic of St. Patrick's Day, Mrs. Ann Duffy was yesterday charged before Justice Delmar by John Elliott with committing an assault upon him with an axe on the night of the 17th of March. The evidence fully developed the fact that in the premises where the assault occurred, 44 Atlantic Street, there was high old times on St. Patrick's Day, and that the inmates of the premises acted in a manner which would have been highly displeasing to the patron saint of old Ireland, who was a man of peace and not of the sword. The evidence did not sustain the charge against Mrs. Duffy, as it appeared that she used the unfeminine instrument mentioned in self-defense. The charge was therefore dismissed, and Anne left the court triumphant. Later that year, a Margaret Lambert is arrested on charge of assaulting Mary Ann Duffy and sentenced to pay a fine of $10 or go to the penitentiary for 2 months, as reported in the Times-Union, who does not relate Margaret's choice. The next year, in May 1872, the Brooklyn Union reports, "Rum again. What it did for a woman. Injuries that may prove fatal." James Canan, a lighterman residing at number 80 Front Street, when he came home from work last night, found his wife and a woman named Ann Duffy both very drunk. 2 emptied bottles of liquor were on the table, and the women were almost prostrated with their contents. Canan ordered Ann to leave the house, and she, not being in a condition to move quickly enough to suit him, he caught her by the shoulders and rushed her out of the room. She took a seat on the floor in the hallway and was settling into a slumber when, it is alleged, Canan came out of the room, dragged her to the stairs, and pushed her down. She reached the bottom of the flight, receiving a scalp wound 4 inches in length and breaking her wrist. The injured woman bled until she was insensible, and Canan, becoming frightened, hurried out for a physician. He found none, and then went to the 2nd Precinct station house and related the occurrence. He was detained, and Officer Horan dispatched to the house for the woman. She was conveyed to the station house, had her wounds dressed by Dr. Barry, and was then taken to the city hospital. Her injuries are of a serious nature and may prove fatal. Canan said that Ann Duffy had been living at his house since last Friday and had been continually drunk, leading his wife into like habits. He denies having pushed her downstairs, but says that she stumbled and fell. Justice Walsh, this morning, committed the prisoner for examination. In 1873, another shawl theft. Stealing a shawl, Ann Duffy was arrested yesterday by Officer Cunningham on a warrant issued by Justice Delmar, on complaint of Ann Murphy, who charged her with purloining a shawl from her valued at $40. The shawl was found in the prisoner's possession when arrested. This is the 4th time Ann has been arrested for stealing clothing, and she has just served a sentence of 3 years in the penitentiary. So she was in prison from March 1870 to March 1873? In 1878, Duffy appears in the New York Times, and we get some background on her life. January 20, 1878, husbands and wives in court. Mrs. Mary Ann Duffy has brought suit in the Court of Common Pleas for an absolute divorce from her husband, Michael Duffy. In her complaint, she alleges that they were married in England on February 13, 1853, that no children have been born to them, and that her husband has been living with another woman since April 15, 1874. She also made petition to the court for alimony and counsel fee, alleging that she is wholly destitute of the means necessary for her support, and for defraying the costs and expenses of the action. Her husband, she stated, has some property, and is earning $12 per day over and above all his expenses. In opposition to these statements, Mr. Duffy put in an affidavit denying the statements as to his property and income, and alleging that the plaintiff has repeatedly had him arrested on the charge of abandonment, but that he has each time been honorably acquitted. Continuing, he says he was married to her in 1853 and lived with her until the early part of the following year, when she abandoned him. and left England for this country, taking with her 17 guineas and 17 shillings of his earnings. He did not hear of her whereabouts until about 1874. He arrived in this country in June 1871. He says that he is informed that from the time of the plaintiff's arrival in this country, she lived with a man named Keyes, who was afterward killed in the Battle of Bull Run. She gave birth to a son, of whom Keyes was the father, and who was serving out a term on Blackwell's Island on a charge of larceny. After Keyes' death, Mr. Duffy says, the plaintiff lived with a man named James Mayer, to whom she was married in 1866 and who has since died. He says that hearing nothing of her, excepting in a letter from Keyes, who said the plaintiff had died at Bellevue Hospital, he gave her up as dead. The suit, Mr. Duffy says, is not brought in good faith, but for the purpose of annoying him and extorting money from him. Affidavits were also appended, showing the plaintiff's marriage to Mayer on September 24, 1866, and showing that she lived with the latter as his wife. Justice Joseph F. Daly yesterday, in a memorandum of his decision, says the affidavits interposed by defendant are not contradicted. They show that plaintiff is not entitled to the divorce she seeks, application denied. In other words, Mary Ann Duffy lost. By 1879, Ann Duffy is an old woman, as reported in the Eagle. Grand larceny. Last Sunday, Mrs. Mary Ann Duffy, an old woman without a home, was arrested by Officer Allen of the 4th Precinct on the complaint of Thomas Laramie of 184 Clinton Avenue, who charged Mary with stealing a fur cape valued at $100. Mrs. Duffy was begging, and being admitted into the house of Mr. Laramie by the basement door, she took the cape from a barrel when the servant's back was turned. Mr. Laramie did not discover his loss until 2 hours after the robbery. He notified the police. From a description, Officer Allen found the woman drunk in Tillery Street. She confessed she had stolen the cape, but would not tell where it was. On Tuesday night, Mrs. Catherine Weaver of 65 Fleet Place, seeing an account of the robbery in the Eagle, returned the article to its owner. Mrs. Duffy went to her house begging. She gave the woman 25 cents and wanted to sell Mrs. Weaver the cape for $1. Mrs. Weaver would not take it, for she knew that such a poor woman could not afford to wear such a fine cape. Mrs. Duffy left the house, but would not take the article with her. Yesterday she was arraigned before Justice Fisher, and on examination was found guilty and held for the action of the grand jury. 4 years later, the Eagle reports on a class of inebriates known as revolvers, whose faces are familiar in all the police courts. The best part of their lives is spent in jail. They are no sooner out of jail than they are in again, on the same old charge of drunkenness. They do not seem to care much about going to the jail, but dread the penitentiary. The feeling with which they regard the penitentiary is shown by the following report of an actual case some few years ago. Ann Duffy, a revolver, arrested on the double charge of being drunk and snatching a gold chain from a boy on Grand Street, was brought up for examination. Justice, how long have you been out of jail? Ann, I haven't been there since April, Your Honor. Justice, what? Didn't I send you up 11 days ago? Here the justice questioned the complainant, the accused, several times, interrupting the witness. Ann, oh no, Judge, that ain't so. He ain't tellin' the truth at all, Judge. Justice, knocking with his gavel. Hold your tongue, I say, or I will lock you up. Ann, oh, Judge, let me spake, avia plays. He struck me first, Judge, the man who sells pig's feet next door, at 6 cents apiece, saw him hit me wid the umbrella on the head, Judge. Justice, but how came you to steal the young man's chain? Ann, me? Oh, now, Judge, I niver stole his chain. I only took it to hit him on the head with it. I didn't go into the store at all. He called me across the street. That I may never see kingdom come, Judge, until I'm dead, if I ever as much as darkened his door that evening. And the man who sells pig's feet will swear the same thing. Justice, well, Ann, as you are an old offender, I will send you to the penitentiary for 90 days. Anne, oh, Lord Judge, send me to the county jail. Charges of drunkenness are the most frequent, but unfortunately, the punishment too often falls with the greatest severity on the wife and family, who have to suffer many privations after furnishing the $10 fine. In 1889, the Brooklyn Citizen's headline, "Don't Disgrace Duffy's Name," appears. That is what the little judge said to a woman. "Anne Duffy, you were drunk," shouted Justice Duffy at the Essex Market Police Court, New York, this morning to a middle-aged woman who stood shivering at the bar. "I have nothing to say," she answered. "What was your name before you took the name of Duffy?" "McGuire," she answered. "Then stick to the name of McGuire and don't disgrace the honest name of Duffy," said the little judge. 5 days this time. I'll make it a year the next time you give the name of Duffy, do you hear? The last we find of Mary Ann Duffy is in the Eagle, May 25, 1894. Ann Duffy of Myrtle Avenue, near Hall Street, who was released from the house of the Good Shepherd yesterday, was found intoxicated in Washington Park yesterday, and this morning was sent back to the house of the Good Shepherd for 2 months. For exclusive extra episodes and content, including images from many of these stories, plus additional stories and other stuff we found in creating this podcast, support us on Patreon, link in the description. Our zine, using these and similar materials about Newtown Creek and Greenpoint, is available at Blue Stockings in New York City or on our website, explodingbrooklyn.com. All music by Charity Case, charitycasemusic.com, unless noted in the episode notes. Also available on explodingbrooklyn.com is Boulevard Years, The Greenpoint Oil Spill, the first novel atop the spill.